Hey, it's Kat and I'm back because what once was will be again. I got my tiki cap on because we are going to use history, mythology, and astrology to divine the mysteries of the Game of Thrones. And all along in this series, I've been talking about this idea of ice and fire and how we are going to use this to determine who Jon Snow's parents are, because he's clearly ice. And there's going to be a lot more about this story in the future, about how the future battle between ice and fire occurs. That I think that if you don't understand this little background about why Jon Snow's parents must be ice, it cannot be Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, then you'll be awfully surprised about how the rest of this Game of Thrones story plays out. So, you should go back and catch parts 1, 2, and 3, because part 1 of the Ice and Fire, I talk about what is the constant in our theory. It is that it's a song of ice and fire. It is a struggle between ice and fire. How was the creature of ice made? We talk about that. This dude tied to a tree with the dragon glass, and it sucked out the winter aspect of the all. So the all has everything. Summer, fall, winter, spring. They sucked out the winter. Conversely, I said that if there was a magical making of the ice beings, there was probably a magical making of the fire beings. Okay, and they would be the summer. So you notice that there's only 2 seasons anybody ever talks about. It's winter and summer. There's no spring and fall right now. Okay, and in part 2, I talked about, pretty much how I disparaged the idea that Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen equals Jon Snow. It doesn't compute because he's ice, Daenerys is fire. He cannot be fire and ice, because then he would have been the prince that was promised, the Prince of Spring. And he is definitely not the Prince of Spring. Everywhere Jon Snow goes, it is ice. So he would have to be some aspect of ice. His parentage has to be ice, not Rhaegar. Okay? And in part 3, I talk about just some general aspects of who the Starks are, how we look at them as related to the North, that they weren't just the kings of the North, they were kings of the winter, and that they had more relation to the North and or things above the wall than those things below it. And then in part 4, I talk about what those relationships are, like where the bloodlines might come from, and how in fact they might have blood of the ice beings running through their veins somehow. Okay, it's something that we don't know for sure or how it happened, but there are definitely aspects that indicate that, and particularly with Lyanna, that somehow she was with a person who was at least part ice. They have ice in their veins. All right. So, having done that, I also talked about that there was some mythology involved in how we get to this aspect. So there's mythology, and then there's the Tudor history. And I've talked about Tudor history before, but let's just hit mythology first. And then the next video, I will talk about the Prince of Spring, the prince that was promised. And we'll talk about what Rhaegar's prophecy he probably read actually said. Okay, so in the background of our Song of Ice and Fire, there's been all sorts of mythology and legend that Mr. Martin has woven into the storyline. And one of the things that you heard right in the beginning of this story was there must always be a Stark in Winterfell. And you have to ask, why is that? And I highly recommend that you go check out the Lightbringer series, because we talk about how we know who Daenerys is, that Lightbringer is not a sword, it's an actual woman. And in part 2, I talk about how it's Daenerys because she's following the path of Venus, and that Venus is called the Lightbringer because it rises in the evening during the summer, and it rises in the winter in the morning before the sun. So bringing the light bringer. And in part 3, I talk about the mythology that goes along with that and how Venus is in the east during the summer, is said to rule with a solar god, Khal Drogo, and when she's in the west during the winter, she is said to rule with a much darker god, and that's Hades. Now, having said all that, you need to know that, because this is how we're going to talk about the mythology that goes along with this idea. Why there must always be a Stark in Winterfell, and what's that got to do with the North? And probably tells you about why creatures can come over that damn wall now. All right, so there are 2 mythologies that are at play with why there's a Stark at Winterfell. Obviously, the first thing you should think about is that the Stark sigil is in fact a wolf. The mythology that goes most closely to that is Norse mythology. In particular, that the land beyond the wall, the land of always winter, is totally represents Niflheim, which is the land of ice and mist, which has also been referred to as the land of always winter. And in the deepest, darkest part of, and coldest part of Niflheim is Helheim, where the goddess Hel rules over the unheroic dead. The goddess Hel was one of 3 siblings born to Loki and a giantess, and these siblings were kind of horrendous. Odin got a prophecy saying that these 3 siblings would cause trouble in the world. Now, besides Hel, who was half flesh, living flesh, and half skeletal or dead flesh, there was also Fenrir the wolf, who could shoot fire out of his eyes and out of his mouth, and her serpent brother Jormungandr, who was the serpent that circled the world and held the oceans together. And you might have heard his name shortened in our series of A Song of Ice and Fire to Jormund, and that's the name of a horn that wakens the dragons. All right, but Fenrir in particular was a giant wolf. He grew really huge, like in a day. So you see that in the dire wolves that the Starks get. They grow really, really fast. Everybody comments about, wow, wasn't he just a puppy the other day? He's gigantic now. And this is what happened with Fenrir. And so Odin and the other gods decided that they would put Hel into Helheim, where she would rule over the dead. Jormungandr he threw into the ocean to hold it together, and Fenrir they chained to the gates of hell, basically. They bound him there with a very slender ribbon that was stronger than anything and created of all the things that don't exist anymore. And so long as Fenrir remained chained at this gate, or this cave that goes into Niflheim and into hell, then no living person can go in, and no dead person can come out. But when Fenrir breaks loose of his bindings, it signals the coming of Ragnarok. And if you read the Poetic Edda, Ragnarok includes crazy things like, besides the wolves howling, breaking free and swallowing the sun and the moon, long nights and long winter. And then there's a fight amongst the gods. So, and we get that's coming up between the others who are, as I've mentioned in this series, are obviously the aspect of God, or of the all that's the winter part. So they're part of the gods, or the god, and that it's likelihood that the fire aspect has also had some magical creation. Winter, summer. Okay, so why there must always be a Stark at Winterfell? Because it's the gates to Helheim. And when the wolf breaks free, it signals the coming of the apocalypse. The dead will come. All hell will break loose, and the dead are coming with them. Okay. But if you caught my Lightbringer series, I talked about Daenerys being the star Venus and traveling in its path, and that there was mythology that went along with that. And one of those mythologies, in fact, was that she ruled with her darker lord during the winter, and that was Hades. And you get the same idea about the underworld, because the 3-headed hound Cerberus guards the gates of the underworld, so nobody can get out and nobody can get in. And if Cerberus breaks free of his chains, then all hell breaks loose, okay? So that's why there has to be a Stark in Winterfell. That's why it's bad there's not one. And Ramsay Bolton and Theon Greyjoy were part of unleashing the hell. So what we also should take away from that, though, then, is that it's very likely that the Starks being in Winterfell, when they say that the Starks must always be in Winterfell, they are probably part of the magic binding that keeps the others and the dead from coming across the wall. Everybody's like, how will they come across the wall? Well, because the magic's been weakened and or destroyed. Okay? And if you think about Hades and Persephone in particular, and how that's the goddess aspect in the winter, that eventually Venus goes east again, heralding the coming of the spring. And that there is this idea or story about who the prince that was promised was. And I'm saying that he and or she is the prince or princess of spring. So the prince that was promised is not Jon Snow or Daenerys. It's what comes after. We're going to talk about that in the next video, how I know that that's a fact. Talk to you later.